The Falkland Islands had never truly mattered to most Britons. These wind-scoured specks of land in the South Atlantic, home to 1,800 souls and roughly 500,000 sheep, existed at the very edge of national consciousness. Most people back in Britain could not have pointed to them on a map, yet on the 2nd of April 1982, these forgotten islands suddenly became the centre of a crisis that would determine whether post-imperial Britain still possessed the military capability and political will to defend its overseas territories. The Argentine military junta that seized power in 1976 had spent years nurturing a claim to what they called Las Malvinas. General Leopoldo Galtieri, who assumed the presidency in December 1981, faced a collapsing economy with inflation exceeding 130%. His regime needed a distraction, something to unite a fractured nation behind the military government. The islands presented an irresistible opportunity. British signals had inadvertently encouraged this miscalculation. In 1981, the Thatcher government announced plans to withdraw HMS Endurance, the only Royal Navy vessel permanently stationed in the South Atlantic. Defence cuts had hollowed out the fleet. The British Antarctic Survey Base on South Georgia operated with minimal protection. To Argentine military planners, Britain appeared to be abandoning its South Atlantic commitments. Operation Rosario commenced before dawn on the 2nd of April. Argentine special forces landed by helicopter near Stanley, the capital, while amphibious troops came ashore at multiple points. The defending garrison consisted of just 69 Royal Marines of Naval Party 8901, commanded by Major Mike Norman. They had received warning of possible invasion only hours earlier. What followed was not surrender, but a fighting withdrawal. The Marines established defensive positions around Government House, where Governor Rex Hunt coordinated the response, still wearing his ceremonial plumed hat. For nearly 3 hours, the small garrison engaged Argentine forces, killing at least one soldier and wounding several others. Lieutenant Bill Trollope's section held a position at Moody Brook, while other Marines defended the approaches to Stanley itself. The numbers made resistance futile. Over 2,000 Argentine troops were landing against fewer than 80 defenders. Governor Hunt, recognizing that continued fighting would only produce casualties without changing the outcome, authorized Major Norman to surrender at approximately 9:15 local time. The Marines had inflicted what damage they could. Now they faced capture and eventual repatriation. Within hours, Argentine forces raised their flag over Stanley. Galtieri flew in to inspect his conquest, posing for photographs that would soon plaster every newspaper in Buenos Aires. The invasion dominated Argentine television. Crowds celebrated in the Plaza de Mayo, and the junta believed its gamble had succeeded. They assumed Britain would protest diplomatically, perhaps impose sanctions, but ultimately accept the fait accompli. This assumption rested on a fundamental misreading of British politics and the particular character of the Prime Minister they faced. Margaret Thatcher had spent 3 years battling economic recession, unemployment, and declining poll ratings. Her government appeared vulnerable, but Thatcher possessed something the junta had not accounted for: an absolute conviction that territorial aggression must never be rewarded, and a willingness to stake everything on that principle. The news reached London late on the 1st of April, hours before the actual landings. Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington, Defence Secretary John Nott, and First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Henry Leach gathered at the House of Commons to brief Thatcher. The military situation appeared grim. The islands lay 8,000 miles from Britain, beyond the range of land-based aircraft, in waters approaching the Antarctic winter. Retaking them by force seemed, to many present, virtually impossible. Admiral Leach disagreed. When asked directly whether the Royal Navy could mount a recovery operation, he answered without hesitation. A task force could sail within days. It would not be easy, it would not be cheap, but it could be done. Parliament convened on Saturday the 3rd of April, the first emergency Saturday session since the Suez Crisis of 1956. The mood inside the Commons was ferocious. Members from both sides of the House demanded action. This was not a partisan moment, but a national one, and the political establishment understood that British credibility hung in the balance. Margaret Thatcher rose to address a chamber crackling with tension. She announced that a large naval task force would sail for the South Atlantic as soon as preparations could be completed. The objective was nothing less than the removal of Argentine forces and the restoration of British administration. There would be no negotiated handover, no diplomatic fudge. Britain intended to fight. Behind closed doors, the machinery of war lurched into motion. Thatcher established a war cabinet, a small group empowered to make rapid decisions without the delays of full cabinet consultation. This inner circle included herself, Defence Secretary John Nott, Foreign Secretary Francis Pym, who replaced the resigned Lord Carrington, Home Secretary William Whitelaw, and the chairman of the Conservative Party Cecil Parkinson. They would meet daily, sometimes multiple times, throughout the conflict. Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse received command of the overall operation from his headquarters at Northwood in Middlesex. Rear Admiral John Sandy Woodward would command the carrier battle group at sea. The operation received the codename Corporate, deliberately bland to avoid any suggestion of colonial adventurism. The logistical challenges bordered on the absurd. Britain needed to project military power across 8,000 miles of ocean to islands, with no proper port facilities, no airfields capable of handling fast jets, and weather conditions that ranged from merely appalling to genuinely dangerous. The South Atlantic winter approached, bringing shortened days, freezing temperatures, and seas that could cripple even large vessels. Naval planners worked through the night of the 3rd and 4th of April. The aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible would form the core of the task force, carrying Sea Harrier jets that represented Britain's only air defence capability in the absence of land-based fighters. These two ships were never meant to operate as independent strike carriers. They had been designed for anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic, supporting NATO operations against Soviet submarines. Now they would carry the entire burden of air superiority in a shooting war. The government invoked emergency requisitioning powers not used since the Second World War. The Cunard liner Queen Elizabeth II received orders to prepare for troop transport. The container ship Atlantic Conveyor would carry vital helicopters and supplies. Roll-on, roll-off ferries from the North Sea routes found themselves suddenly painted grey and loaded with military equipment. In total, over 50 civilian vessels would join the task force, their crews volunteering for a voyage into a war zone. On Monday, the 5th of April, the first elements of the task force departed Portsmouth. Thousands of people lined the harbour walls, waving flags and cheering as Hermes and Invincible slipped their moorings. The scenes resembled something from 1939, a departure into uncertainty with no guarantee of return. Sailors crowded the flight decks, some waving back, others simply staring at the receding coastline. The diplomatic track ran parallel to military preparations. Britain secured a crucial United Nations Security Council resolution, Resolution 502, demanding immediate Argentine withdrawal. The vote passed 10-1, with only Panama opposing and 4 nations abstaining. This gave Britain vital international legitimacy, framing the conflict as resistance to aggression rather than colonial reconquest. American support remained uncertain. President Ronald Reagan valued both his relationship with Thatcher and his administration's efforts to court Latin American governments against communist influence. Secretary of State Alexander Haig began shuttle diplomacy between London and Buenos Aires, seeking a negotiated solution that would prevent his NATO ally from fighting a war America officially wished to avoid. The task force that steamed south represented an extraordinary improvisation. No military planner had ever seriously considered fighting a conventional war in the South Atlantic. The contingency simply did not exist. Now admirals, generals, and logisticians found themselves solving problems that had no precedent in modern British military experience. HMS Hermes led the carrier group, a ship commissioned in 1959 that had been scheduled for decommissioning. Her sister carrier Invincible, newer but smaller, had actually been sold to Australia. That sale was hastily cancelled. Between them, the two carriers embarked just 20 Sea Harriers, the vertical takeoff fighters that would face the entire Argentine Air Force. Pilots understood they would be outnumbered roughly 10 to 1. The Harrier itself embodied a technological gamble, its ability to take off and land vertically made carrier operations possible without catapults and arresting gear, but the aircraft had never been tested in sustained combat. Naval aviators trained constantly during the voyage south, practicing interceptions over the grey Atlantic swells. They developed tactics on the move, working out how to maximize the Harrier's maneuverability against faster conventional fighters. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and thousands of other necessities required transportation across 8,000 miles of ocean. The Royal Fleet Auxiliary, the civilian crewed support arm of the Royal Navy, mobilized every available vessel. Tankers would refuel warships at sea, storeships would transfer supplies by helicopter and jackstay rigs while both vessels maintained cruising speed. This technique, known as replenishment at sea, would occur hundreds of times during the campaign. Ascension Island became the critical staging point. This volcanic speck in the mid-Atlantic, normally home to a small American signals intelligence station and a BBC relay transmitter, transformed into one of the busiest airports in the world. Royal Air Force transport aircraft shuttled constantly between Britain and Ascension, delivering equipment, personnel, and mail. Wide Awake Airfield operated around the clock, its single runway handling more traffic than Heathrow. The amphibious force assembled separately. 3,000 Royal Marines of 3 Commando Brigade embarked on the assault ships HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid, along with the requisitioned ferry Canberra. The 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment and 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment joined the force, adding elite infantry capability. These were professional soldiers, volunteers who had trained for exactly this kind of operation. Many had served in Northern Ireland. None had experienced conventional warfare. Brigadier Julian Thompson commanded 3 Commando Brigade. His staff worked through the voyage, planning an assault on islands they had never seen, using maps that dated from the 1930s and intelligence that ranged from sketchy to non-existent. They did not know the precise strength or disposition of Argentine forces. They did not know which beaches were suitable for amphibious landing. They did not know whether the civilian population would cooperate or resist. Equipment shortages plagued the force. Cold weather gear proved inadequate for Antarctic conditions. Some units lacked sufficient night vision equipment. Radios designed for European warfare struggled with the distances involved. Logisticians scrounged, improvised, and requisitioned whatever they could find. Civilian mountaineering equipment appeared alongside military stores. Ski poles intended for recreational use became essential mobility aids on the boggy terrain. Medical planning assumed heavy casualties. Surgical teams deployed aboard the hospital ship Uganda, a converted educational cruise liner still bearing her civilian paintwork. Casualty evacuation procedures anticipated scenarios that medical officers hoped would never materialize but knew probably would. The voyage south took 3 weeks. Men trained constantly, sharpening skills that peacetime exercises had allowed to dull. They cleaned weapons, studied terrain models, and attended briefings on Argentine forces and equipment. At night, they wrote letters home, many expressing thoughts they had never before committed to paper. The task force pressed southward toward whatever awaited in the cold waters ahead. South Georgia provided the first test. This frozen dependency, lying 800 miles southeast of the Falklands themselves, had been seized by Argentine forces on the 3rd of April. Recapturing it would demonstrate British resolve and provide a staging area for subsequent operations. Operation Paraquet commenced on the 21st of April. The conditions proved savage. Special Air Service and Special Boat Service reconnaissance teams inserted by helicopter onto the Fortuna Glacier encountered winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. 2 Wessex helicopters crashed attempting to extract the freezing soldiers, their rotors unable to cope with the whiteout conditions. A 3rd Wessex, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley, somehow rescued all the survivors in a feat of airmanship that earned him the Distinguished Service Order. The assault on the 25th of April succeeded despite these setbacks. Royal Marines and Special Forces overwhelmed the small Argentine garrison at Grytviken, the abandoned whaling station that served as South Georgia's principal settlement. An Argentine submarine, the Santa Fe, was caught on the surface and disabled by helicopters firing missiles and depth charges. The vessel limped into harbour trailing oil, her crew surrendering alongside the shore garrison. Captain Brian Young, of HMS Antrim, signalled London with news that would lift spirits across Britain. His message read simply that British forces had repossessed South Georgia, adding with characteristic naval understatement that God and Her Majesty had been served. Margaret Thatcher, briefing journalists outside Downing Street, advised them to rejoice at the news. The first British territory had been liberated. The main event lay ahead. On the 30th of April, Britain declared a 200-mile total exclusion zone around the Falklands. Any vessel or aircraft entering this zone would be considered hostile and engaged without further warning. The Argentine Navy, possessing a carrier, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, represented a genuine threat to the task force. Neutralizing that threat became the immediate priority. The air war began on the 1st of May. Royal Air Force Vulcan bombers, flying from Ascension Island in the longest bombing raid in aviation history, struck the runway at Port Stanley. The operation, codenamed Black Buck, required 17 aerial refuelings across nearly 8,000 miles of ocean. A single bomb cratered the runway centerline, preventing Argentine fast jets from operating, but leaving the strip usable for transport aircraft and helicopters. Sea Harriers followed with attacks on Stanley and the secondary airfield at Goose Green. Argentine Mirage and Dagger fighters rose to intercept, and the first air combat of the war erupted over the islands. The results shocked Buenos Aires. Harriers shot down 2 Mirages and a Canberra bomber without loss. The combination of AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles, superior pilot training, and the Harrier's extraordinary maneuverability proved devastating. But Argentina possessed a weapon that terrified naval commanders. The Exocet anti-ship missile, manufactured by France, could be launched from aircraft flying below radar coverage and would skim the waves at nearly the speed of sound before striking its target. The Argentine Navy had received 5 air-launched Exocets before the war. Each one represented a potential catastrophe. On the 4th of May, that catastrophe materialized. 2 super-étendard aircraft of the Argentine Naval Aviation approached the task force at extreme low altitude, evading radar detection. They launched their Exocets at maximum range. HMS Sheffield, a Type 42 destroyer on radar picket duty, detected the incoming missiles just seconds before impact. One Exocet struck amidships, its unspent rocket fuel igniting fires that the crew could not control. 20 sailors died. Sheffield burned for 6 days before sinking under tow. She was the first Royal Navy vessel lost to enemy action since the Second World War. The task force suddenly understood that this war would cost blood, and the price might prove higher than anyone had anticipated. The loss of Sheffield concentrated minds in London and aboard the fleet. But the decision that followed would generate controversy lasting decades. On the 2nd of May, 2 days before Sheffield burned, the nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror had been tracking a more significant target. The General Belgrano was an Argentine cruiser with an unusual history. Originally commissioned as USS Phoenix in 1938, she had survived the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and served throughout the Pacific War before Argentina purchased her in 1951. Now approaching her 44th year of service, she remained a formidable warship, armed with 6-inch guns and escorted by 2 destroyers carrying Exocet missiles. Conqueror had shadowed the Belgrano group for over 30 hours. Commander Christopher Reeford Brown reported the cruiser's position and course to northward, where Admiral Fieldhouse faced a decision. The Belgrano was sailing outside the declared total exclusion zone, apparently heading away from the task force. But Argentine naval movements suggested a coordinated pincer attack, with the carrier group approaching from the north, while Belgrano's group threatened from the south. The War Cabinet convened at Chequers on the afternoon of the 2nd of May. Margaret Thatcher, presented with the military assessment that Belgrano posed a genuine threat, regardless of her current heading, authorized the attack. The rules of engagement were changed to permit submarine action outside the exclusion zone. Reeford Brown received his orders. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon local time, Conqueror fired 3 Mark 8 torpedoes, a weapon design dating from the Second World War. 2 struck Belgrano. The first hit forward, the second struck aft near the engine room. The explosions tore through the aging hull, killing 275 men almost instantly. Power failed. The ship began listing immediately. Captain Hector Bonzo ordered abandon ship within 20 minutes. Belgrano sank stern first, taking 48 more sailors with her. The survivors, many suffering burns, wounds, or hypothermia, crowded into life rafts on freezing seas. Rescue operations did not commence until the following day, due to severe weather. In total, 323 Argentine sailors perished, nearly half of all Argentine deaths during the entire war. The sinking achieved its strategic objective with brutal efficiency. The Argentine Navy withdrew to port and remained there for the duration of the conflict. The carrier 25 de Mayo, which had been preparing to launch an airstrike against the British fleet, retreated to shallow coastal waters where British submarines could not follow. The surface threat to the task force effectively ended on the 2nd of May, but the political cost proved substantial. Critics accused Thatcher of torpedoing not just a ship, but also a Peruvian peace initiative that had been developing through diplomatic channels. The Belgrano was sailing away from the exclusion zone, they argued, posing no immediate threat. The attack was portrayed as unnecessary escalation, even murder. Defenders countered that naval warfare does not operate on such convenient assumptions. Ships can change course in minutes. The Belgrano's escorting destroyers carried Exocets that could have devastated the task force. Waiting until the threat became immediate would have been militarily irresponsible. The exclusion zone was never intended as a safe harbour for hostile warships manoeuvring against British forces. The controversy obscured a simpler reality. Britain was fighting a war. Argentina had invaded sovereign territory and refused to withdraw. The Belgrano was an enemy warship operating in a declared combat zone. Its sinking, however costly in human terms, removed a genuine military threat and fundamentally altered the naval balance. 2 days later, Sheffield burned. Whatever moral qualms might have attended the Belgrano decision evaporated in the smoke rising from the stricken destroyer. Both sides now understood that this war would be fought without restraint, and neither would emerge unscathed. The amphibious landing could not be delayed. Winter approached, ships were consuming fuel and supplies at unsustainable rates, and every day without troops ashore gave Argentina time to reinforce. Brigadier Thompson's staff had identified San Carlos Water, a sheltered inlet on the western coast of East Falkland, as the optimal landing site. Operation Sutton would commence on the 21st of May. San Carlos offered crucial advantages. The surrounding hills would limit Argentine air attacks to narrow approach corridors, giving ship-based air defences better engagement opportunities. The anchorage was distant from the main Argentine garrison at Stanley, reducing the risk of immediate counterattack. Local settlements could provide intelligence and logistical support. The terrain, while challenging, permitted beach operations. The landings began before dawn. Royal Marines of 40 Commando went ashore at San Carlos settlement itself. 45. Commando landed at Ajax Bay, where an abandoned refrigeration plant would become the main field hospital. 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment secured the Sussex Mountains overlooking the beachhead. 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment established positions at Port San Carlos. By daylight, over 4,000 troops held a perimeter that would expand throughout the day. Argentine response came with the sun. Waves of Skyhawk and Dagger jets swept through the narrow valleys surrounding San Carlos Water, attacking the ships clustered in the anchorage. What followed became known as Bomb Alley, a sustained aerial assault that would test the task force to destruction. The frigate HMS Ardent was hit repeatedly on the 21st of May. Bombs struck her stern, destroying the Seacat missile launcher and starting fires that spread through the ship. 22 men died. Ardent sank the following day, the first of several losses in the anchorage. Her survivors, many wounded, were evacuated to other vessels still under attack. The 23rd of May brought further disaster. HMS Antelope, another frigate, took 2 bombs that failed to detonate on impact. Staff Sergeant James Prescott of the Royal Engineers attempted to defuse one of these weapons that evening. It exploded, killing him instantly and starting fires that reached the magazine. Antelope broke apart in a spectacular explosion, her back breaking as ammunition cooked off throughout the night. 2 days later, the destroyer HMS Coventry and the container ship Atlantic Conveyor fell victim to coordinated attacks. Coventry took multiple bomb hits and capsized within 20 minutes, killing 19 of her crew. Atlantic Conveyor, struck by 2 Exocets meant for the carriers, burned fiercely. She carried vital Chinook helicopters intended to lift troops and supplies across the islands. Only 1 Chinook escaped the flames. The loss would force soldiers to march distances originally planned for helicopter transport. Yet something remarkable emerged from this carnage. Argentine bombs were failing to explode at an astonishing rate. Aircraft delivering weapons at extremely low altitude to avoid defensive fire gave their ordnance insufficient time to arm. Bombs passed through ship hulls and out the other side without detonating. Had the arming mechanisms functioned properly, British losses would have been catastrophic. The air defenders also extracted a terrible price. Sea Harriers, operating from the carriers lurking beyond the islands, intercepted wave after wave of attackers. Rapier missile batteries ashore, once properly established, brought down jets attempting low-level attacks. Ship-based Seawolf and Sea Dart systems claimed additional victims. By the end of May, Argentina had lost over 30 aircraft to combat and accidents. Pilot losses could not be replaced. The beachhead held. Supplies flowed ashore despite the attacks. Field hospitals treated casualties from both the naval and ground forces. The logistics chain, improvised and fragile, somehow functioned. British forces now occupied a secure position on East Falkland. The next phase would require them to fight their way across 50 miles of hostile terrain to Stanley. The breakout from San Carlos began before the beachhead was fully secure. 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, received orders to advance south and capture the settlement at Goose Green. Intelligence suggested a garrison of modest strength. That assessment proved dangerously wrong. The march to Goose Green covered 15 miles across open terrain. Paratroopers carried everything they would need for battle, each man burdened with over 80 pounds of weapons, ammunition, and equipment. They moved by night, reaching their assault positions in the early hours of the 28th of May. Ahead lay an Argentine force that outnumbered them nearly 3-1. The battle commenced at 2:30 in the morning. Paratroopers advanced across the narrow isthmus connecting Darwin to Goose Green, engaging prepared defensive positions in the darkness. Progress was slow and costly. Argentine conscripts, dismissed by some British officers as poorly trained and unmotivated, fought with unexpected determination. Machine gun positions swept the open ground. Artillery and mortars rained down on the advancing companies. Colonel Jones grew frustrated with the pace of advance. At Darwin Hill, where A Company had stalled against entrenched positions, he personally led a charge against an Argentine trench line. Moving ahead of his men, firing his submachine gun, Jones was struck by enemy fire and fell mortally wounded. He died shortly afterwards, leaving Major Chris Keeble to assume command. The battle raged throughout the day. British forces, now fighting without their commanding officer, pushed forward through sheer aggression and superior fieldcraft. Harrier strikes and naval gunfire support helped suppress Argentine positions. By evening, the surviving defenders had withdrawn into Goose Green itself, where over 100 civilians were being held in the community hall. The following morning, Keeble negotiated an Argentine surrender. When the prisoners emerged, the British were astonished. Nearly 1,000 Argentine soldiers laid down their arms, far exceeding any intelligence estimate. 2nd Battalion had attacked a force nearly triple their strength and won. The cost was 17 dead and 35 wounded. Colonel Jones received a posthumous Victoria Cross. The main advance on Stanley proceeded simultaneously. Royal Marines of 45. Commando and 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment began what would become legendary as the Yomp, a forced march across the island's boggy interior. The term, marine slang for a long-distance march under load, would enter the national vocabulary. Conditions were appalling. Men carried 100 pounds or more across terrain that swallowed boots with every step. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Wind and rain were constant. The loss of helicopters aboard Atlantic Conveyor meant supplies had to be manhandled forward or carried by the single surviving Chinook, which flew mission after mission until its exhausted crew could barely function. By early June, British forces had closed on the ring of mountains surrounding Stanley. Argentine defenders held strong positions on Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Mount Harriet, Wireless Ridge, and Mount Tumbledown. These features commanded the approaches to the capital. They would have to be taken by direct assault. The night attacks began on the 11th of June. 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment assaulted Mount Longdon in fighting that lasted until dawn. Argentine defenders, many of them well-trained Marines rather than conscripts, contested every rock and bunker. Sergeant Ian Mackay led a charge against a machine gun position that was decimating his platoon, destroying the emplacement before being killed. He too received a posthumous Victoria Cross. 45. Commando took 2 sisters, while 42 commandos stormed Mount Harriet. Each battle produced its own catalogue of heroism and horror. Men fought hand to hand in the darkness, using bayonets when ammunition ran low. The screams of the wounded echoed across the frozen hillsides. The final battles erupted on the night of the 13th of June. Wireless Ridge and Mount Tumbledown remained in Argentine hands, the last significant obstacles before Stanley itself. Both positions were heavily defended by troops who understood that retreat meant total defeat. 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, still mourning Colonel Jones, attacked Wireless Ridge with ferocious determination. Naval gunfire from HMS Ambuscade and artillery support from the Blues and Royals helped suppress defensive positions. The Paras advanced through withering fire, clearing trench after trench until the ridge was secured by dawn. Argentine resistance, fierce at first, collapsed as the night wore on. Mount Tumbledown proved far more costly. The 2nd Battalion Scots Guards assaulted positions held by the 5th Marine Infantry Battalion, one of Argentina's elite units. These were not conscripts, but professional soldiers fighting from prepared defences among the rocky outcrops. The battle lasted over 10 hours and became the bloodiest single engagement of the ground campaign. Guardsmen fought their way uphill against machine guns, snipers, and determined counterattacks. Major John Kisley led his company in a bayonet charge when ammunition ran critically low, personally killing 2 Argentine soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. The darkness was punctuated by explosions, tracer fire, and the shouts of men locked in desperate struggle. 9 Scots Guards died taking Tumbledown. 43 more were wounded. By morning on the 14th of June, British forces overlooked Stanley from the surrounding heights. Argentine troops could be seen streaming back into the town, their defensive line shattered. White flags began appearing on buildings. Organised resistance was crumbling. Brigadier Thompson and Major General Jeremy Moore, who had arrived to assume overall command of land forces, recognised the moment. Further bombardment of Stanley risked civilian casualties and was unnecessary. The Argentine position was hopeless. Over 11,000 soldiers were now trapped in a small town with British forces commanding every approach. General Mario Menendez, the Argentine military governor, requested a ceasefire. Negotiations proceeded through the afternoon. At 9 o'clock in the evening local time, Menendez signed the instrument of surrender in Stanley, formally ending 74 days of conflict. Argentine forces laid down their weapons. The Falkland Islands were British once more. The human cost had been substantial. 255 British servicemen died during the campaign. 777 more were wounded. 6 ships had been sunk and 10 others damaged. Argentina suffered 649 dead, over 1,000 wounded, and 11,000 taken prisoner. 3 cruisers, a submarine, and over 100 aircraft were destroyed. The consequences extended far beyond the South Atlantic. In Argentina, the junta collapsed within days. Galtieri resigned in disgrace. Democratic elections followed in 1983, ending military rule. The war had achieved what years of domestic opposition could not, discrediting the generals so thoroughly that Argentina has remained democratic ever since. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher's political fortunes transformed overnight. A government facing possible electoral defeat rode a wave of patriotic sentiment to a landslide victory in 1983. The Falklands factor, as commentators termed it, reshaped British politics for a decade. Military lessons proved equally significant. The war demonstrated that modern warships remained vulnerable to relatively simple weapons. It validated vertical takeoff aviation, special forces operations, and the importance of professional training over numerical superiority. Defense planners worldwide studied the campaign for insights into conventional warfare in the missile age. The islands themselves remain British. Their population, now over 3,000, holds annual commemorations of the liberation. A substantial military garrison ensures that no future invasion could succeed. The graves of those who fell lie in cemeteries at San Carlos and Goose Green, tended by islanders who remember what was sacrificed for their freedom. Britain had proven, against considerable odds, that it still possessed both the capability and the resolve to defend its interests. The old lion still had teeth,